Well, and it's sort of a very strange story that takes us into a lot of different and weird avenues that go far beyond some of the things that people might expect. Now, when it comes to the Men in Black, certainly for the general public, the first thing that everybody thinks about is Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones and the Men in Black movies. And it's sort of a testament, I guess, to the movies, that because they were so successful, that this image has been sort of propagated that the Men in Black are agents of some sort of government body, some sort of secret organisation. But the reality is very different to that. There aren't really many parallels between the movie versions of the Men in Black and the real Men in Black, beyond the fact that they wear black suits. That really is the only similarity. When we look at the real reports of the Men in Black, what the witnesses are telling us is encounters with something that is far stranger than anything that can come from some sort of government agency. The Men in Black, in many respects, don't even look human, and that also goes along with the Women in Black as well, as I'll tell you as we go along. Now, I've written 3 books on the Men in Black altogether. That's the most recent one, which is just called Men in Black. And the history of the Men in Black is an intriguing one. It goes back to the early 1950s and revolves around a man named Albert Bender. And it's a little known fact that Albert Bender was also someone who had a tradition of a woman in black legend in his family as well. And again, many people don't know that. And I don't think it's a coincidence that he was so tied to both the Men in Black mystery and the Women in Black subject. That's the cover of one of the most recent books I've done on Women in Black. And just like the Men in Black, they actually sort of don't come across as appearing human. In fact, they're actually anything but human. A number of theories have been put forward, which I'll explain as we go along, to try and rationalise who or what the Men in Black and the Women in Black might be. Now, although the sort of so-called modern era of ufology began in 1947, it actually wasn't until the early 1950s that the Men in Black entered upon the scene. There were literally just 1 or 2 cases that could be construed as MIB reports from 47, but on the other hand, they could actually have been sort of government agents who, back then, the guys dressed in black suits and fedoras. So it's a little bit of a grey area, but for the most part, the subject did not begin until about 1951-52. And it all revolved around a man named Albert Bender. Albert Bender lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and he was someone who was heavily interested in UFOs, but he was also deeply involved in the world of the occult and the supernatural. And he wasn't what I would call a dabbler. He was someone who was very well versed and learned and experienced in the field of the occult. And the house that Bender lived in, if you've ever seen the movie Psycho and creepy Norman Bates' mother's house, that's sort of the house that Bender lived in. And if all rooms possible, he rented the attic. And so, you know, we had this sort of slightly unusual guy who was heavily involved in the occult, living in an attic. And on top of that, he actually retitled, so to speak, this attic room as his Chamber of Horrors. And he essentially set it up as kind of like a little mini museum with paintings on the walls of demons and skeletons, and he would hang rubber spiders from the ceiling and things like that. And he was someone who, as soon as the UFO subject kicked off, sort of really gravitated towards it and began investigating the subject. And he created this group called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. And everything was going fine for literally around about 18 months or so. He put out this magazine called Space Review, and it contained all the latest sighting reports. And he really began to get a huge following all across the planet. Russia, South America, Australia, Europe, United States, Canada. He found himself copying the newsletter every single night pretty much to get them mailed out to people all across the planet. And everything was going well until late 1952, when Bender suddenly said, out of the blue, that he was going to close down the IFSB, he was going to shut down his magazine, and he wasn't going to have anything else to do with the UFO subject. And a lot of people in ufology thought this was just some sort of publicity stunt to try and reinforce the magazine and get more sales. Kind of like the issue where, if you've got a favourite band and they say, this is going to be our farewell tour, so you better come and see us. And they hike the tickets up and everybody goes and sees them. And then 2 years later, oh, we're coming back, we got bored, That's what they thought was going to happen with Bender. It was a publicity stunt. But actually it wasn't. He walked away from ufology for about 8 years and then very, very briefly came back to write a book on the subject called Flying Saucers and the Three Men. Now, when Bender walked away, it was sort of a big puzzle and a big mystery. And one person who started looking into this was this guy, Gray Barker, who wrote a book in 1956 titled They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. And incidentally, Barker also wrote a book on Mothman. When we think of Mothman, everybody thinks of John Keel and the Mothman prophecies. But Gray Barker wrote a book also on Mothman in 1970 called The Silver Bridge. And The Silver Bridge, in my opinion at least, is a really good book. Although Keel's book contains more factual data, The Silver Bridge sort of creates a really atmospheric imagery of Point Pleasant and what was going on in the town, and the sort of this ominous cloud that descended upon it when the Mothman was seen. And so Barker was someone who was deeply involved in ufology, but also with regard to strange creatures like Mothman as well. And he also looked into the famous Flatwoods monster of West Virginia, which isn't too far away from here, an encounter that occurred in September 1952, when again sort of a fiery-eyed humanoid type creature was seen in the woods and hills around Flatwoods. So Barker was someone like Bender who was primed to get involved in ufology, and when he found out that Albert Bender had quit ufology, Barker saw a story here. There was something going on that he wanted to get to the bottom of. And he wrote about it in this book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. And as you can see from the cover, it creates this imagery instantly of the three men in black. And there was a very good reason why the cover shows that particular picture, because in the early years at least, the men in black would typically turn up as a trio. They were always in threes. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, the movie incarnations, if you like, are very different to the real Men in Black. And a perfect example of that is that when Albert Bender found himself plunged into this sort of nightmarish scenario, he said that one particular night he was sitting in his attic room and he started to feel sick and ill, lightheaded, clammy and cold, and he felt like he was going to pass out. So he lay down on the bed, and suddenly the room was filled with this overwhelming odour of like brimstone or sulphur. And that's something that we see in classic supernatural experiences and incidents, where very often there is this sort of overwhelming odour of sulphur involved. And Bender said that as he lay on the bed in this sort of semi-altered state, that these three men in black, kind of like that, looking shadowy and dark to start with, literally sort of manifested in his attic room. In other words, they didn't knock on the front door and flash an ID card, like in the movies. What they actually did, as I said, was materialise in the room in this shadowy, smoky form, and then they took on a physical form and threatened him telepathically to leave ufology or else. And Bender, who wasn't, I guess, the sort of person who had a very strong character, he was actually quite a weak-willed character, and someone who essentially crumbled overnight and quit ufology and said, I'm not having anything to do with it. Now, initially after that at least, he had some second thoughts and continued for a few weeks to investigate UFO reports and compile them. And as he did so, the men in black would turn up again and again and again. And he would talk about how he would go to the cinema late at night in Bridgeport, be walking home, say,